The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Rosa Martinez pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Riverside Community College. It was 11 p.m., and the building was mostly quiet except for the occasional sound of her footsteps echoing off the polished floors. She had been working this night shift for 3 years now, cleaning classrooms, offices, and restrooms while most people were home with their families. At 42, Rosa had grown used to being invisible. Students would walk past her during the day as if she wasn't there. Professors barely acknowledged her presence when she cleaned their offices. To them, she was just part of the furniture, someone who made their world clean and organized while they focused on more important things. But Rosa had a secret dream that kept her going through those long, lonely nights. She wanted to get her high school diploma. She had dropped out at 16 when her family needed her to work. And now, 26 years later, she was finally ready to try again. Her 2 children, Tony and Isabella, were old enough to take care of themselves for a few hours in the evening. This was her chance. The decision hadn't been easy. Rosa had saved every penny for months to pay for the classes. She worked double shifts on weekends, cleaned houses during the day, and even did laundry for neighbors. Her hands were rough and cracked from all the cleaning chemicals, but she didn't care. Education was worth any sacrifice. When Rosa walked into her first math class 3 weeks ago, she felt completely out of place. The other students were mostly teenagers, fresh out of high school, or young adults in their 20s. They carried expensive laptops and wore designer clothes. Rosa clutched her worn notebook and a pencil she had found in one of the offices she cleaned. She always sat in the back row, hoping no one would notice her. The math problems that seemed easy to everyone else felt like puzzles she couldn't solve. When the teacher, Professor Williams, wrote equations on the board, Rosa would copy them carefully into her notebook. But the numbers and symbols felt foreign to her. Professor Williams was the kind of teacher who commanded respect through fear. He was tall and thin, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to look right through you. He wore expensive suits and spoke in a voice that suggested he thought he was better than everyone else. The younger students were intimidated by him, but they at least belonged in his classroom. Rosa felt like an intruder. During the first week, Rosa tried to blend in. She listened carefully to every word, took notes on everything, and stayed quiet. But math had never been her strong subject, and after being away from school for so long, even simple problems felt overwhelming. When Professor Williams asked the class to solve basic algebraic equations, Rosa would stare at her paper, her mind going blank. The other students seemed to pick up concepts quickly. They would nod when Professor Williams explained something, raise their hands to answer questions, and work through problems with confidence. Rosa felt like she was drowning in a sea of numbers and formulas that made no sense to her. After the second class, Rosa stayed behind to ask Professor Williams for help. She approached his desk nervously, her hands shaking slightly as she held her notebook. "Excuse me, Professor," she said quietly. "I'm having trouble with some of these problems. Could you maybe explain them again?" Professor Williams looked up from his papers with obvious annoyance. He glanced at Rosa's notebook, filled with incorrect answers and eraser marks, and let out a small sigh. "These are basic problems," he said coldly. "If you can't handle this level of mathematics, perhaps you should consider a different class. Something more ... suitable for your situation." Rosa felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she didn't give up. "I just need a little more time to understand. I haven't been in school for a while." Professor Williams studied her for a moment, taking in her worn clothes and tired appearance. "How long has it been since you were in school?" "About 26 years, Rosa admitted quietly. Professor Williams shook his head. "That's a long time. Maybe it's too long. Some people just aren't cut out for academic work, especially at your age. You might want to think about whether this is really the right path for you." His words stung, but Rosa forced herself to stay calm. "I'll keep trying. I really want to learn," Professor Williams shrugged. "That's your choice, but don't expect me to slow down the entire class for one student." As the weeks went by, Rosa continued to struggle. She would go home after her cleaning shift and stay up until dawn, trying to understand the homework problems. She borrowed math books from the library and watched online tutorials on the computer at the local library. Nothing seemed to help. The numbers still felt foreign and the concepts remained just out of reach, but Rosa didn't quit. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening she would finish her cleaning duties, wash her hands, and walk to the classroom. She would sit in her usual spot in the back row and try her best to keep up. The other students had stopped noticing her, and Professor Williams had stopped calling on her after she gave too many wrong answers. Rosa began to believe that maybe Professor Williams was right. Maybe she wasn't smart enough for this. Maybe she was too old, too tired, too far removed from the world of education. When she looked around the classroom at the younger students who seemed to understand everything so easily, she felt like a fraud. The hardest part was the way Professor Williams treated her. He would roll his eyes when she asked questions, speak to her in a condescending tone, and make comments that suggested she didn't belong there. Once, when she asked for clarification on a problem, he said, "Perhaps you should focus on something more practical, like learning a trade." But Rosa had come too far to give up now. She thought about her children, Tony and Isabella, who were proud of their mother for going back to school. She thought about all the years she had spent cleaning, up after other people, being invisible, being treated like she didn't matter. This was her chance to prove that she was more than just a cleaning lady. What Professor Williams didn't know was that Rosa had been paying attention to everything, even when she seemed lost. She had been absorbing information even when she couldn't solve the problems. Her brain was working harder than it had in years, trying to make sense of mathematical concepts that had been foreign to her for so long. Rosa also didn't know that she was about to face her biggest challenge yet. Professor Williams had grown tired of her questions and her presence in his classroom. He had decided that it was time to make an example of her, to show her once and for all that she didn't belong in an academic setting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Rosa continued to sit in the back row, taking careful notes and trying her best to understand. She had no idea that her entire life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, casting their harsh light on a woman who refused to give up on her dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. It was Thursday evening, and Rosa walked into the math classroom feeling more nervous than usual. She had spent the entire week struggling with quadratic equations, staying up late trying to understand the homework problems. Her notebook was filled with crossed-out attempts and eraser marks, but she still couldn't grasp the concepts. Professor Williams was already at the board, writing complex equations with quick, confident strokes. Rosa took her usual seat in the back row, opened her worn notebook, and tried to follow along. The other students seemed comfortable, chatting quietly before class started. Rosa kept her head down, feeling like an outsider as always. "Today we're going to work on more challenging quadratic equations," Professor Williams announced. "These problems require you to think beyond simple substitution. You need to understand the underlying mathematical principles." Rosa copied the equations from the board, her handwriting careful and neat. She had always been good with her hands, precise in her work, but math felt different. The numbers seemed to dance around on the page, never quite making sense. As Professor Williams worked through the first example, Rosa tried to follow each step. She wrote down everything he said, hoping that somehow it would click. But when he moved to the second problem, she was already lost. The symbols and numbers might as well have been written in a foreign language. 20 minutes into the class, Professor Williams assigned practice problems. "Work through these on your own. I'll come around to check your progress." Rosa stared at the first problem, her mind completely blank. She watched as other students began writing immediately, their pencils moving confidently across their papers. She felt that familiar knot in her stomach, the one that told her she didn't belong here. She tried to remember the steps Professor Williams had shown them, but everything was jumbled in her mind. She wrote down a few numbers, erased them, tried. Again, nothing looked right. The harder she tried, the more confused she became. Professor Williams began walking around the room, glancing at students' work, Rosa could hear him making encouraging comments to some students, offering hints to others. As he got closer to her row, her heart began to race. "Good work, Kevin," she heard him say to the student 2 seats ahead of her. "You're getting it." Then he was standing behind her, looking over her shoulder at her nearly blank paper. Rosa could feel his presence, could smell his expensive cologne. She tensed up, waiting for his judgment. "Having trouble again, Rosa?" His voice was loud enough for nearby students to hear. "I'm trying," Rosa whispered, not looking up from her. "Paper, this is basic material. We covered this last week." His tone was getting sharper, more impatient. Rosa felt her cheeks burning. A few students had turned to look at her, and she wanted to disappear. "Could you maybe explain it one more time?" Professor Williams let out an exaggerated sigh. "I can't keep stopping the entire class to reteach concepts you should already understand." The room was getting quieter. More students were paying attention now, sensing the tension. Rosa kept her eyes fixed on her paper, wishing she could become invisible. "You know what your problem is?" Professor Williams continued, his voice carrying. "Across the room, you're trying to run before you can walk. Maybe you should consider dropping down to a basic arithmetic class." Rosa finally looked up, meeting his eyes. She saw no kindness there, no understanding. Just cold judgment. "I want to learn this." "I know I can do it if I just practice more." Professor Williams shook his head. "Some people have a natural aptitude for mathematics, others don't. It's not a character flaw, it's just reality." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow. She had heard similar things before, from teachers when she was young, from supervisors at work who thought she was only good for cleaning. But hearing it here, in front of all these students, was particularly painful. "I'll keep trying," Rosa said quietly. Her voice barely audible. Professor Williams was about to move on when something seemed to occur to him. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just thought of something cruel. "Actually, Rosa," he said, turning back to face her, "since you're having so much trouble with these basic problems, maybe we need to try a different approach." He walked to the front of the classroom and picked up a fresh piece of chalk. The entire class was watching now, sensing that something was about to happen. "Let me give you something that might help put things in perspective," Professor Williams said, beginning to write on the board. "If you can't handle quadratic equations, perhaps you'll have better luck with this." Rosa watched in growing horror as he wrote out a complex equation that looked nothing like anything they had studied. It was filled with strange symbols, Greek letters, and mathematical notation she had never seen before. The equation seemed to go on forever, covering nearly half the whiteboard. "There," Professor Williams said, stepping back to admire his work. "This is a differential equation from my advanced calculus class. It involves limits, derivatives, and integration by parts. Why don't you come up here and solve it for us?" The classroom was dead silent. Rosa could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She stared at the equation, feeling completely overwhelmed. It looked like hieroglyphics to her, completely incomprehensible. I don't understand," Rosa stammered. "Of course you don't," Professor Williams said with mock surprise. "This is advanced mathematics, the kind of thing that requires years of study and natural mathematical ability. But surely someone who thinks they can master quadratic equations should be able to handle this, right?" A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rosa could see some of them looking down at their desks, embarrassed for her. Others were watching with curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. "Come on, Rosa," Professor Williams continued, gesturing toward the board. "Don't be shy. Show us what you've got." Rosa felt trapped. She couldn't solve the equation, and everyone in the room knew it. But she also couldn't just sit there and let him humiliate her without trying. Slowly, she stood up from her seat. "I don't know how to do this kind of math," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Well, that's honest at least," Professor Williams replied. "But you see, this is what real mathematics looks like. This is what students study after they master the basics. If you can't handle simple quadratic equations, how do you expect to ever understand something like this?" He was enjoying himself now, Rosa realized. He liked making her feel small, liked showing off his superiority in front of the class. She had seen this kind of behavior before, from bosses who thought they were better than their cleaning staff, from people who looked down on anyone who worked with their hands. "Take your time," Professor Williams said, crossing his arms and leaning against his desk. "I'm sure someone with your BACKG or OUND will figure it out eventually." The way he said background made it clear what he meant. He was talking about more than just her education. He was talking about her job, her social class, her entire life. He was saying that people like her didn't belong in places like this. Rosa walked slowly to the front of the classroom, her legs feeling weak. She stood before the whiteboard, staring at the impossible equation. Behind her, she could feel the eyes of every student in the room. Some probably felt sorry for her. Others might have been enjoying the show. Professor Williams stood nearby, waiting for her to admit defeat. He expected her to break down, to apologize, to maybe even drop out of the class. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change everything he thought. He knew about the woman standing before him. Rosa picked up a piece of chalk with trembling fingers and stared at the equation. Something deep in her mind was stirring, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Rosa stood frozen in front of the whiteboard, staring at the complex equation that Professor Williams had written to humiliate her. The chalk felt heavy in her trembling hand, and she could hear the whispers of students behind her. Her heart was racing, and she felt like she might faint from the embarrassment. But then something strange happened. As she looked at the symbols and numbers on the board, a memory flickered in the back of her mind. It was like a candle being lit in a dark room. She blinked, trying to focus, and suddenly the equation didn't look completely foreign anymore. 25 years ago, Rosa hadn't been Rosa Martinez, the cleaning lady. She had been Rosa Delgado, a brilliant mathematics student at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia in Bogotá. She had been one of the top students in her engineering program, known for her ability to solve complex problems that stumped her classmates. Rosa had grown up in a middle-class family in Colombia. Her father was a mathematics professor, and her mother was a physics teacher. From a young age, Rosa had shown an exceptional talent for numbers. While other children played with dolls or toys, Rosa would spend hours solving mathematical puzzles that her father brought home from the university. By the time she was 16, Rosa was already taking advanced calculus courses at the local university. Her professors were amazed by her intuitive understanding of complex mathematical concepts. She could see patterns and solutions that others missed, and she had a gift for explaining difficult ideas in simple terms. Rosa had dreamed of becoming an engineer, of building bridges and designing systems that would help her country. She was accepted into one of the most prestigious engineering programs in South America, and her future looked bright. She was going to be the first woman in her family to earn a university degree, and everyone was proud of her. But then everything changed. Rosa was in her third year of university when the violence in Colombia escalated. Her father, who had been vocal about political issues, received death threats. One night, armed men came to their house looking for him. The family barely escaped, but they knew they couldn't stay. Within a week, Rosa's entire world fell apart. Her family fled to the United States as refugees, carrying only what they could fit in a few suitcases. They left behind their home, their careers, their entire life. Rosa had to abandon her studies just months before graduation. When they arrived in Miami, Rosa discovered that her years of education meant nothing. Her transcripts were in Spanish, her university wasn't recognized by American institutions, and she didn't have the money to start over. She needed to work immediately to help her family survive. Rosa took whatever job she could find. She cleaned offices, worked in restaurants, and did laundry for other families. She told herself it was temporary, that she would find a way to continue her education. But months turned into years, and life kept getting in the way. When Rosa met Miguel, a kind construction worker who didn't care about her past, she thought maybe it was time to let go of her academic dreams. They got married, had 2 children, and Rosa focused on being a wife and mother. She convinced herself that her old life had been a dream, that maybe she had never been as smart as she thought. Miguel died in a construction accident. When Tony was only 8 and Isabella was 6, Rosa was left alone with 2 children to raise and no skills that anyone seemed to value. She took the night cleaning job at the community college because it paid better than her other options, and she had been there ever since. Over the years, Rosa had buried her past so deeply that she sometimes forgot it had ever existed. She told herself that she was just a cleaning lady, that she had never been anything more. The pain of losing her dreams was too much to bear, so she pretended they had never existed. But now, standing in front of this equation, something was awakening inside her. The symbols on the board were starting to make sense. She recognized the structure of the differential equation, the way the variables related to each other. It was like remembering a song she hadn't heard in decades. Rosa's hand, which had been shaking moments before, grew steady. She looked at the equation more carefully, and suddenly she could see the solution. It was as if a fog had lifted from her mind, revealing knowledge that had been hiding there all along. The equation on the board was about finding the rate of change of a function. Rosa remembered studying similar problems in her advanced calculus class at the university. She had been good at these types of problems, better than most of her classmates. The professor had even asked her to tutor other students. Rosa began to see the equation differently. Instead of a jumbled mess of symbols, she could see the logical structure underneath. There was a pattern here, a sequence of steps that would lead to the solution. She had solved problems like this before many times. The classroom was completely silent now. Professor Williams was watching her with a smug expression, expecting her to give up and return to her seat in defeat. The students were waiting to see what would happen next. Some probably felt sorry for her, while others might have been enjoying the show, but Rosa was no longer thinking about the audience. She was remembering who she used to be before life had forced her to become someone else. She was remembering the young woman who had loved mathematics, who had seen beauty in equations and elegance in proofs. Rosa raised the chalk to the board and began to write. Her handwriting was clear and confident, nothing like the uncertain scribbles she had been making in her notebook for weeks. She started by identifying the type of differential equation, then began working through the steps needed to solve it. As she worked, more memories came flooding back. She remembered her favorite professor at the university, Dr. Hernandez, who had taught her that mathematics was like music, with its own rhythm and harmony. She remembered staying up late in the library, working through complex problems with her study group, feeling the satisfaction of finding the right answer. Rosa's mind was working faster now, making connections that had been dormant for years. She could see not just one way to solve the equation, but multiple approaches. She remembered techniques she had learned in her advanced courses, shortcuts and elegant methods that most students never learned. Behind her, the classroom was still silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the uncomfortable quiet of watching someone struggle. It was the hushed attention of witnessing something unexpected, something remarkable. Professor Williams had stopped smiling. He was watching Rosa's work with growing confusion and concern. This wasn't supposed to happen. Rosa was supposed to admit defeat to prove his point about her limitations. Instead, she was methodically working through a problem that most of his advanced students would struggle with. Rosa finished the first approach to solving the equation and stepped back to look at her work. It was correct, she knew it was, but she also knew there was a more elegant way to reach the same answer. Without hesitation, she began writing again, showing an alternative method that demonstrated an even deeper understanding of the mathematical principles involved. As she worked, Rosa felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt smart again. She felt capable. She felt like the person she had been before life had convinced her that she was nothing more than a cleaning lady. The mathematics felt natural, like coming home after a long, difficult journey. The equation was almost solved now, and Rosa could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being seen. Rosa's chalk moved across the whiteboard with growing confidence. Each symbol she wrote was precise and purposeful, nothing like the hesitant scribbles she had been making in her notebook for weeks. The differential equation that had seemed impossible just minutes before was now revealing its secrets to her. Step by step. As she worked through the problem, Rosa could feel her mind firing on all cylinders for the first time in decades. It was like a computer that had been running slowly suddenly, getting a boost of power. Mathematical concepts that had been buried deep in her memory were surfacing. As clear and sharp as if she had learned them yesterday, she solved the equation using the first method, then stepped back to check her work. The answer was correct, she was certain of it, but Rosa wasn't finished. She remembered from her university days that there were often multiple ways to approach complex problems, and she had always enjoyed finding the most elegant solution. Without hesitation, Rosa began writing again, this time using a different approach. She applied integration by parts, a technique she had mastered in her advanced calculus course at the Universidad Nacional. Her hand moved smoothly across the board, creating a solution that was not only correct but also beautifully organized. Behind her, the classroom was absolutely silent. Even the usual sounds of students shifting in their seats or tapping pencils had stopped. Everyone was watching in stunned amazement as the woman they had barely noticed for weeks demonstrated a level of mathematical understanding that surpassed most of them. Professor Williams stood frozen near his desk, his face pale with shock. His carefully constructed assumptions about Rosa were crumbling before his eyes. This wasn't possible. The woman who struggled with basic algebra couldn't possibly be solving advanced calculus problems with such ease and precision, but Rosa wasn't done yet. She had remembered a third approach, one that involved a substitution technique that made the problem even more straightforward. She had learned this method from her favorite professor in Colombia, and it had always impressed her classmates. Rosa began working through this solution as well, her confidence growing with each step. As she wrote, Rosa found herself explaining her work out loud almost without realizing it. First, we identify this as a second-order linear differential equation, she said, her voice stronger than anyone in the room had ever heard it. We can solve it by finding the characteristic equation and then applying the appropriate boundary conditions. The students leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. Rosa's explanation was clearer and more detailed than many of the lectures they had heard from Professor Williams. She was breaking down complex concepts into understandable pieces, showing not just how to solve the problem, but why each step was necessary. The key is recognizing the pattern, Rosa continued, turning to face the class as she spoke. Once you see that this equation follows a specific form, you can apply the standard techniques. It's like following a recipe, but you need to understand the ingredients first. One student, a young man named Chris, who had been struggling with calculus in his other classes, raised his hand tentatively. Could you explain that substitution part again? I've never seen it done that way. Rosa smiled, and for the first time in years, it was the smile of a teacher sharing knowledge she loved. Of course. This technique is called U-substitution. You replace a complex part of the equation with a simpler variable, solve the easier problem, and then substitute back. Watch. She turned back to the board and worked through the substitution step by step, explaining each decision she made. Her explanation was so clear that even students who had been lost in their regular calculus classes began to understand. Professor Williams found his voice at last. Where did you learn to do this? He asked, his tone completely different from the condescending voice he had used earlier. Rosa paused, her chalk hovering over the board. For a moment, the old fear tried to creep back in. She had spent so many years hiding her past, convincing herself that it didn't matter, that she was just a cleaning lady. But standing here, with the proof of her abilities written clearly on the whiteboard, she couldn't deny who she really was anymore. I studied engineering at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Rosa said quietly, still facing the board. I was in my third year when I had to leave. The classroom buzzed with whispers. Students exchanged glances, trying to process this information. The woman who cleaned their classrooms at night had been an engineering student at one of South America's most prestigious universities. Why did you leave? Asked a student named Jennifer, her voice full of genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Rosa turned around to face the class. And for the first time in years, she stood up straight. She had been hunched over mops and cleaning supplies for so long that she had forgotten how to carry herself with confidence. But now, standing before this equation she had solved with ease, she remembered. "My family had to flee Colombia because of the violence," Rosa said simply. "We came to the United States as refugees. My education didn't transfer, and I needed to work to help support my family. I told myself it was temporary, but temporary became permanent." The room was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the silence of people trying to understand, to process a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about the woman in front of them. Professor Williams was struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. "But you've been struggling with basic algebra in my class. How is it possible that you can solve advanced calculus problems?" Rosa looked at him directly for the first time since she had started attending his class. "I convinced myself that I had forgotten everything. I spent so many years being told that I was just a cleaning lady, that I was nothing more than that. I started to believe it myself. When I came to your class, I was so nervous and scared that I couldn't think clearly. I had buried my knowledge so deep that I couldn't access it anymore." She gestured to the whiteboard behind her, where 3 different solutions to the differential equation were written in clear, precise handwriting. "But this problem, it was like a key that unlocked something I thought I had lost forever. It reminded me of who I used to be before I forgot." One student, a young woman named Amy, spoke up. "You said you studied engineering. What kind of engineering?" Rosa's eyes lit up. "I was studying civil engineering. I wanted to design bridges and buildings. I was particularly interested in seismic design, making structures that could survive earthquakes. Colombia is in an earthquake zone, and I wanted to help make buildings safer for people." As Rosa spoke about her old dreams, her passion was evident. This wasn't the timid woman who had been sitting in the back row for weeks. This was someone who had once believed she could change the world with her knowledge and skills. Professor Williams sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the realization of what he had done. He had spent weeks belittling and dismissing a woman who was more qualified than most of his advanced students. He had made assumptions based on her current job and appearance, never bothering to learn about her background or abilities. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made terrible assumptions about you." "I was wrong, completely wrong," Rosa nodded, accepting his apology with grace. But she wasn't finished yet. She had more to show them, more to prove to herself. She picked up the chalk again and began writing a 4th solution, using a technique so advanced that even Professor Williams had to think hard to follow her logic. The transformation was complete. Rosa Martinez, the invisible cleaning lady, had become Rosa Delgado, the brilliant mathematician she had always been inside. The silence in the classroom was broken by the sound of slow clapping. It started with Chris, the student who had asked Rosa to explain the substitution method. Then Jennifer joined in, followed by Amy, and soon the entire class was applauding. Some students were wiping tears from their eyes, moved by what they had just witnessed. Rosa stood at the front of the classroom, still holding the piece of chalk, overwhelmed by the response. For so many years, she had been invisible. People walked past her as she cleaned their offices, never seeing her as a person with dreams, hopes, and incredible abilities. Now, for the first time in decades, she was being seen for who she truly was. Professor Williams rose from his chair, his face red with shame and embarrassment. "Rosa, I need to speak with you after class. What I did today was unacceptable, and I need to make this right." As the applause died down, students began asking Rosa questions. They wanted to know more about her story, about her life in Colombia, about how she had managed to remember such complex mathematics after so many years away from it. "Could you help me with my calculus homework?" asked Chris. "My professor in my other class doesn't explain things as clearly as you just did." Rosa felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I would be happy to help," she said, surprising herself. With how confident she sounded, after class ended, most of the students lingered, still talking about what they had witnessed. Word spread quickly through the college. By the next morning, Rosa's story was being discussed in hallways, cafeterias, and faculty meetings throughout the campus. Dr. Patricia Chun, the head of the mathematics department, heard about the incident from 3 different sources before noon the next day. She immediately called Professor Williams into her office to get the full story. When he finished explaining what had happened, Dr. Chun shook her head in disbelief. "You mean to tell me that we have had a brilliant mathematician working as a janitor in our building for 3 years and nobody knew?" she asked. Professor Williams nodded miserably. "I made terrible assumptions about her. I judged her based on her job and her struggles with basic problems, never thinking that there might be more to her story." Dr. Chun was quiet for a moment, thinking, "We need to help her. Someone with her abilities shouldn't be limited by outdated credentials and bureaucratic obstacles. I'm going to make some phone calls." Meanwhile, Rosa continued with her regular routine, but everything felt different. When she cleaned classrooms that evening, students would stop to talk with her. They asked about her background, sought help with homework problems, and treated her with a respect she hadn't experienced in years. Tony and Isabella, Rosa's children, noticed the change in their mother immediately. She walked taller, smiled more, and seemed to have a new energy about her. When Rosa told them what had happened in class, Tony hugged her tightly. "Mom, I always knew you were the smartest person I knew," he said. "I'm glad everyone else finally sees it too." Isabella, who was studying to become a teacher, was particularly inspired. "You should become a professor, Mom. You explain things so much better than most of my teachers." Within a week, Dr. Chun had arranged a meeting between Rosa and the college's academic advisor. They discussed Rosa's options for completing her education and getting her foreign credentials recognized. The process would take time and effort, but for the first time in years, Rosa felt like her dreams might be possible. The college also offered Rosa a part-time position as a math tutor while she worked on completing her degree. The pay was better than her cleaning job, and the schedule would allow her to take classes during the day. It felt like a miracle. Professor Williams, meanwhile, was going through his own transformation. Rosa's story had forced him to examine his prejudices and assumptions about his students. He realized that he had been judging people based on their appearance, their age, and their backgrounds rather than giving them a fair chance to show their abilities. He began staying after class to offer extra help to struggling students, particularly those who were older or from non-traditional backgrounds. He changed his teaching style, becoming more patient and encouraging. Most importantly, he started to see his students as complete human beings with their own stories and potential. 3 months later, Rosa took the placement exams for advanced mathematics courses. She scored in the top 5%, earning credit for several courses and allowing her to skip ahead in her studies. The college newspaper ran a story about her journey, and she received letters of support from students, faculty, and community members. Rosa's story also inspired changes throughout the college. The administration created a new program to help immigrant students get their foreign credentials evaluated and recognized. They established mentorship programs connecting non-traditional students with faculty members who could help guide their academic journeys. A year later, Rosa was enrolled full-time in the engineering program at a nearby university. The community college had helped arrange for her credits to transfer, and she was on track to complete her degree within 2 years. She continued working as a math tutor, and her waiting list of students grew longer each semester. Professor Williams became one of Rosa's biggest supporters. He wrote recommendation letters for her, helped her apply for scholarships, and often referred struggling students to her for tutoring. Their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to deeply respectful. "Rosa taught me that everyone deserves to be seen and valued," Professor Williams told his colleagues. "I spent years looking at people's surfaces instead of recognizing their depths. She changed how I teach and how I see the world." Rosa's children watched their mother's transformation with pride and amazement. Tony decided to study mathematics himself, inspired by seeing his mother's passion for the subject. Isabella incorporated Rosa's story into her education coursework. writing papers about the importance of recognizing hidden potential in all students. On the second anniversary of that fateful night in Professor Williams' classroom, Rosa was invited to speak at the college's graduation ceremony. She stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of graduates and their families, and thought about how different her life had become. 2 years ago, I was invisible, Rosa told the audience. I was just someone who cleaned your classrooms and emptied your trash cans. But I learned that we all have hidden depths, untapped potential, and dreams that deserve to be pursued regardless of our age or circumstances. She paused, looking directly at the non-traditional students in the audience, the older learners, the immigrants, the people who might feel like they didn't belong. Don't let anyone convince you that it's too late to chase your dreams, Rosa continued. Don't let anyone tell you that you're not smart enough or that you don't belong in academic spaces. You have more potential than you realize, and it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. After the ceremony, Rosa was approached by dozens of people who thanked her for sharing her story. Many were immigrants who had given up on their educational dreams. Others were older students who had been discouraged by professors or circumstances. Rosa listened to each story and offered encouragement and practical advice. As Rosa walked across campus that evening, she passed the classroom where her life had changed forever. The building was quiet now, but she could still remember the feeling of standing at that whiteboard. Rediscovering who she really was, Rosa Martinez, former cleaning lady, was now just months away from earning her engineering degree, but more than that, she had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told that their dreams were impossible. Sometimes, Rosa reflected, it takes just one moment of courage to change everything. Sometimes all it takes is someone believing in you, even if that someone is yourself.